The air was thick with tension as the sun rose over the French countryside. Edward, the young King of England, stood atop a hill, surveying the vast expanse of land before him. His heart was heavy, but his resolve was unbreakable. He had not spent a year on the continent, just to retreat at the first sign of trouble. His allies were restless, their fear and hunger gnawing at their morale, but Edward was determined to press on. For months he had held back from engaging the French in battle, carefully choosing his moments and reinforcing his strategy. He sent out his trusted earls Salisbury, Derby, and Northampton to wreak havoc on the French countryside. They burned villages, looted towns, and spread terror wherever they went. Sir John of Hainault, a fierce warrior, led his men into the town of Origny, where they ransacked a Benedictine nunnery, raping the nuns and leaving the place in ruin. Sir John then moved on to Guise, where he burned the town to the ground. Inside the castle at Guise, his own daughter, Jean, pleaded with him to spare the lands of her husband, the heir to the Count of Blois. But Sir John had his orders, and he carried them out without mercy. The destruction was widespread, and the French people were in chaos. Dozens of towns and villages were reduced to ashes in just a few days. The sight would have made even the most hardened cardinal faint, but it was exactly what Edward wanted. He needed to show the French that he was a force to be reckoned with. Meanwhile, a messenger from King Philip of France arrived at La Flamerie, where Edward was camped. The messenger offered to do battle on a specific day, either the 21st or 22nd of October, in a place free from rivers, walls, or earthworks. Edward knew this was his chance. He chose the site of the battle carefully, a place between La Flamerie and La Capelle. The French army was just 4 miles away, and the stage was set. On the evening of the 22nd, Edward and his advisors finalized their plans. They remembered the tactics that had worked so well at Duplin Moor and Halidon Hill. They would invite the French to charge, and their archers would be positioned on either side to rain down arrows on the advancing cavalry. Edward's position had a dense wood on one flank and a slope in front, which would slow down the French attack. The next morning, the king and his men attended Mass, and then they prepared for the battle. All knights were ordered to dismount, and their horses and baggage were placed in a small wood behind the 3 battalions of men. Trenches were dug to protect the archers, and the English and their allies formed up in 3 battalions. Edward himself commanded the largest, including the English household knights. The 2nd Battalion, mainly composed of men from the Low Countries, was led by the Duke of Gelderland and Sir John of Hainault. The 3rd was under the command of the Duke of Brabant. A smaller force, led by Sir Lawrence Hastings, the Earl of Warwick, Lord Berkeley, and Sir John Mullins, was tasked with holding the rear and preventing any desertions. When everything was ready, Edward mounted a humble palfrey and rode along the lines with Robert d'Artois, Sir Reginald Cobham, and Sir Walter Manny by his side. He made knights of the bravest men and encouraged all his troops to fight with honor. Banners were raised and pennons flew above each battalion. The scene was one of solemn determination. But as the morning passed and noon approached, nothing happened. The French army, restless and impatient, sent up a great shout at the sight of a hare running across the ground. The Count of Hainault, thinking the attack was about to begin, knighted 14 men on the spot. They were later known as the Knights of the Hare, much to the amusement of the chronicler Froissart. The Count's embarrassment led him to withdraw his forces. Later, a letter arrived from the King of Jerusalem and Sicily, warning Philip that the stars predicted he would lose if he fought Edward. The advisors around Philip were divided. Some argued that the trenches in front of the English lines were too deep, making a charge impossible. Others insisted that Philip must fight to avoid dishonor. In the end, those who advocated withdrawal won the argument. Philip agreed and ordered his men to build defenses to protect their position. There would be no battle that day. Edward was left with a bitter taste in his mouth. His allies claimed he had won a moral victory, but he knew better. The victory was as much Philip's, and as the allies began to withdraw, Edward had no choice but to follow. The battle that never was had left him empty-handed, and the road ahead looked more challenging than ever. But Edward was not a man to give up easily. He returned to the Low Countries, still bound by the agreements of the previous autumn to stay until his debts were paid. The situation was dire, especially since the Commons in England had refused to pay a new subsidy for the war. Yet Edward proved adaptable. He entered into new negotiations with Jacob van Artevelde, a wealthy merchant and revolutionary leader in Flanders. Van Artevelde's people were starving and riotous, thanks to Edward's strategy of controlling the wool trade. Flanders depended on English wool, and the lack of it had led to widespread dissent. When Count Louis of Flanders declared his loyalty to Philip, the people of Ghent, Bruges, and Ypres revolted. Van Artevelde took control, destroying the Count's authority and seeking an alliance with Edward. Van Artevelde and Edward hatched a plot to attack French-held territories in Flanders. However, by the time Van Artevelde made his move, Edward's army was already retreating from La Flamingerie. The withdrawal of the Allies relieved the pressure on Philip, and the Flemish, now at war with the French, realized their precarious position. Van Artevelde had no choice but to join the English alliance completely. For Edward, this meant a significant change. If the Flemish broke their allegiance to the King of France, they would fall under an interdict and face a huge fine. This solution was for Edward to claim the title of King of France. This way, the Flemish would not be breaking their oaths, nor would they have to pay the fine. On 26 January 1340, Edward publicly claimed the title of King of France. It was a bold move, one that would alter the course of history and launch the 100 Years' War. The prophecy that Edward would wear 3 crowns was about to be exceeded, as he claimed a 4th. In the market square of Ghent, Edward sat on a makeshift throne, proclaiming himself King of France. The act was more than a gesture. It was a declaration of war. The French crown was now his to claim, and the conflict that would follow would change the face of Europe for centuries to come. Edward's claim was a deeply serious move, one that would bind him and his allies to a long and bloody struggle. But it was a move he was willing to make, for the sake of his nation and his ambitions. The road ahead was uncertain, but Edward was ready to face it. In the year 1337, Edward III of England faced a significant challenge. He wanted to claim the throne of France, a move that was fraught with complex political and social implications. The order in which he styled himself as king, whether King of France and England or King of England and France, was not just a matter of preference but carried deep symbolic weight. It could imply who was the superior kingdom and thus who should be subservient to the other. When Edward first considered adopting the French title in October 1337, he played it safe. He issued 2 sets of letters, one styled King of France and England, and the other King of England and France. This way, he covered his bases and avoided any immediate conflict. However, actually claiming the title of King of France was a different story. Philip VI of France, who was already on the throne, was not amused. He mocked Edward for quartering the English and French coats of arms, pointing out that Edward had placed the English arms in the most prestigious position, the upper dexter quarter. This was a subtle but clear challenge to Philip's authority. Philip's anger reached its peak on February 8, 1340, when Edward's new seal arrived. Edward issued a declaration in French, inviting the people of Flanders to recognize him as the King of France. The seal clearly showed the arms of France and England quartered, with the motto, "Edward, by the grace of God, King of France and England." Philip was furious and ordered a search for copies of the declaration, decreeing that anyone found with one would be hanged as a traitor. The Pope, too, was surprised and upset by Edward's claim. He argued that heirs of females could not inherit the throne of France, and that there were others with a stronger claim. The Pope accused Edward of following evil counsel and issued a strong protest, effectively siding with France. To make matters worse, Edward's envoy, Nicolas Fieschi, was kidnapped by French agents in Avignon, leading the Pope to place the entire Kingdom of France under an interdict, a severe punishment that suspended all religious services. The English were equally surprised and confused by Edward's new title. They felt that their king had adopted the arms of France and placed them above those of England without consulting them. This was damaging to English pride and seemed to show a lack of respect for the English people. Edward's high-handed actions, including demands for money and other orders, were becoming increasingly unpopular. Edward, however, saw things differently. After spending 18 months on the continent, he had grown more ambitious. He saw himself as the vicar of the Holy Roman Empire, the self-proclaimed King of France, and a champion of Christendom. He needed the financial support of England to fund his claims and wars, but his actions were increasingly alienating his own people. In February 1340, Edward returned to England, leaving his pregnant queen in Ghent. He faced a hostile parliament, which refused to grant him a new subsidy without concessions. To address their concerns, Edward summoned a new parliament and promised to address their grievances. In return, the Commons granted him a significant tax, including a levy on sheep, wool, and other goods. They also demanded reforms, such as the confirmation of liberties, the pardoning of debts, and the reform of administrative practices. Edward agreed to these demands, and the relationship between the king and his subjects was temporarily mended. On April 16, 1340, while Edward was jousting at Windsor Castle, a messenger arrived with troubling news. Two of Edward's closest companions, the Earls of Salisbury and Suffolk, had been captured while spying on the defenses of Lille. They had been surrounded and overpowered, with one of their companions hanged immediately. The earls and the remaining men were taken captive. This news was a stark reminder of the dangers and complexities of Edward's ambitious claim to the French throne. King Edward faced a series of devastating blows. His close friends, the Earl of Salisbury and the Earl of Suffolk, had been captured by the French, which sent shockwaves through his court. The Earl of Salisbury was his main commander in the Low Countries, and his capture left the region in chaos. The French took advantage of this, destroying towns and villages, including the capital of Hainault, Valenciennes. Sir Walter Manny's brother, Giles, was killed, and an attack on Tours nigh failed. To make matters worse, the Scots were pressing into England, forcing Edward to seek a peace treaty he didn't want. To protect his wool trade, Edward had to ban its export, fearing French raids. Feeling the urgency, Edward decided he had to return to France to lead an attack on the French army. If he didn't, he risked losing Flanders and his wife, Philippa, who was still in Ghent after giving birth to their son, John. Edward needed ships, especially the large Mediterranean galleys that Philip had secured from the Genoese. He wrote to the Pope, urging him to release Nicolanus Fieschi to arrange for the commissioning of vessels. He also appealed to the Venetians, asking for 40 galleys. In his letter, Edward tried to justify his cause, explaining that Philip had taken his lands in France and offering to settle the dispute through single combat or other challenges. This attempt to portray himself as a brave and divinely chosen king seemed more like a plea for support, hinting at his self-doubt. Edward's strategy was crumbling, both economically and militarily. On May 27th, he appointed his son as regent during his absence, with the council headed by the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Earl of Huntingdon. However, the archbishop soon learned that the French were gathering a massive fleet in the Channel to trap Edward. The archbishop warned Edward, but his advice only fueled the king's anger. Edward accused the archbishop of opposing the war and forced him to resign. The archbishop's resignation was accepted, and Robert Stratford, his brother, was appointed chancellor instead. Despite the risks, Edward resolved to fight. He gathered a fleet of about 120 to 147 ships and 12,000 men, while the French had nearly 200 ships and 19,000 men. On June 20th, Edward stepped aboard his largest ship, the Thomas, and received his Great Seal. He gave the order to sail towards Flanders on June 23rd. The next night was tense, with the English fleet anchored near the mouth of the river's Win, facing a wall of French ships. The next morning, on the feast of St. John the Baptist, Edward waited for the French to attack. When they didn't, he took the initiative, knowing the sun and the tide were in his favor. The English fleet advanced, and the longbowmen's arrows rained down on the French ships, overwhelming their crossbowmen. The English ships grappled with the French, and men-at-arms boarded the enemy vessels. Despite being wounded in the thigh, Edward remained on deck, inspiring his men. The Christopher, one of the largest French ships, was captured, and the French fleet began to crumble. By late afternoon, the second line of the French fleet was open to attack, and the third line fled. The Battle of Sluys was a decisive victory for Edward, with the French losing about 17,000 men, including their commanders. Back in London, the news of the victory was met with disbelief and joy. The city had been bracing for a French attack, and now the threat was gone. In Ghent, Philippa and their new son, John, celebrated Edward's triumph. Edward, deeply grateful, thanked God repeatedly and sent letters to the archbishops and bishops in England, asking for their prayers. He also wrote to his son, detailing the capture of the Christopher and other large ships, which would boost English trade and security. Once he recovered from his injury, Edward visited shrines to give thanks for his victory. Only then did he travel to Ghent to see his wife and son, having secured a crucial victory in his war with France. Edward was laid up with an injury, but he didn't waste his time. He spent it talking with Van Artevelde, a Flemish leader, about how to continue the war against France. They had already planned to besiege two important French towns, Tournai and Saint-Omer, which were on the border of Flanders. Tournai was especially important because it was loyal to the French king, Philip, and taking it would be a big win for Edward. However, there were problems. Edward's victory at Sluys, a naval battle, had cost a lot of money, and the Archbishop of Canterbury wrote that it was hard to get the wool needed to fund the next expedition. The Peruzzi and Bardi banks, which had promised to help, were also not delivering the money they had agreed to. Edward knew he had to keep things moving to avoid the same issues he faced in 1339, when a lack of funds caused his plans to fall apart. To keep the momentum, Edward split his army into two. The smaller part, under Robert d'Artois, was supposed to attack Saint-Omer. Edward himself would lead the larger part to besiege Tournai once he was healed, but things didn't go as planned. Robert d'Artois was an old man who didn't understand Edward's new strategies and couldn't inspire the troops. He used old methods and was soundly defeated. Many soldiers were lost, and only a few made it back to Edward. The siege of Saint-Omer never even started. Edward arrived at Tournai on July 23rd, just 1 month after the Battle of Sluys. As he set up his positions around the city, he realized Tournai was well prepared for a siege. The walls were massive, and the river Scheldt ran through the city, making it impossible to cut off its water supply. Philip had also stationed a strong French garrison there, and the city's 20,000 inhabitants were ready to defend it. The suburbs had been burned to prevent the Allies from using them. It looked like it would be a long siege. Feeling confident after his victory at Sluys, Edward decided to challenge Philip to a duel. He sent a letter to Philip, calling him Count of Valois, and demanded the French throne. He said that since the quarrel was between them, they should settle it in a personal duel. If that didn't work, he suggested a battle between each king and 100 men, or a full battle between their armies in front of Tournai. Edward wanted a decisive victory to avoid the high costs of a long siege, and to move forward with his goal of reclaiming his lost land. Philip's response was to deny that he knew anyone called Philip de Valois, which frustrated Edward. Despite this, Edward and his allies focused on taking Tournai. However, the city's defenses were strong, and the burghers were active in defending it. The first serious attack on the city walls came a month later, on August 26th. 2,000 Flemish soldiers tried to break through the northern defenses but failed. Another attempt a week later also failed. As the siege dragged on, Edward became more and more frustrated. His money supplies were running out, and his German allies were not helping much. The Hainaulters on the southern side of the city were more active and had some successes, but they were also disillusioned by their allies' lack of effort. The Brabanters had a falling out with Van Artevelde, and the situation worsened when a Brabantine lord insulted Van Artevelde, who then drew his sword and killed him. Despite all this, the city's defenses remained unbroken. The French army, led by Philip and including the young King David of Scotland, was approaching. Edward knew he would have a hard time resisting them. All the Allied armies, despite their disagreements, came together to face the French advance on September 7th. The citizens of Tournai prepared to attack the English from behind when the battle started. Edward set up a rear guard and got his archers ready. Pope Benedict, seeing the situation, sent secret messengers to both Philip and Edward. Philip, he sent William Amasai, a low-ranking messenger, to explain the dangers and suggest a peace. To Edward, he sent William Bateman, a trusted friend, to remind him that winning one battle doesn't mean he would always win, and to list the reasons why peace would be better for him. These messages softened the ground for a more personal appeal. On the night of September 22nd, Jeanne de Valois, Edward's mother-in-law and Philip's sister, came to Edward's tent. She begged him to think of the damage being done to her son's lands and to make peace. Edward, facing a serious dilemma, saw this as an opportunity to start negotiations with Philip. He agreed to send an embassy to meet Philip at the chapel of Esplichin. Edward's main problem was money. Tourne, I might have been close to surrendering, but he couldn't afford to continue the siege. A truce was agreed upon on September 25th, to last until the following midsummer. It applied to all the places where the two kings were at war, including France, the Low Countries, Scotland, and Gascony. All military operations were to stop immediately, and both sides could keep their conquests for the time being. There would be freedom to travel and trade, and prisoners would be released. While some said the Treaty of Esplichin was unfair to Edward, he actually gained a lot. Tourne, I wasn't that important to him, and a prolonged campaign would have left him in even worse financial shape. By agreeing to the truce, he stopped the drain on his finances, prevented further attacks on his lands, and kept his allies in the Low Countries. He also gained time to focus on his financial problems. Edward remained undefeated in battle, and some even saw the truce as a victory. A tournament was held in Ghent in October to celebrate his return. However, the treaty didn't solve Edward's financial issues. He was still in debt and had to stay in Ghent to sort things out. In November, he wrote a letter to the Pope, claiming he had withdrawn from the siege at the Pope's request, even though he had a good chance of success. He also accused the Archbishop of Canterbury of hoping he would be killed, and of trying to drive a wedge between him and his wife, Philippa. The Archbishop might have said something about their marriage that risked ending it, but it's not clear what exactly he said. One intriguing possibility is that the Archbishop accused Philippa of adultery. This is unusual because medieval marriages only required the wife to be faithful. However, their seventh child, Edmund, was born on June 5, 1341, which suggests he might have been conceived on or around September 12, 1340, while Edward was at Tournai and Philippa was in Ghent. If Philippa remained in Ghent, it raises questions about the timing of Edmund's conception. Despite the treaty, Edward faced more challenges. He was still in Ghent, trying to deal with his debts. In October, he offered to pay his creditors with wool, but they refused because the market was flooded and wool had lost value. Edward was frustrated and wrote to the Pope in November, claiming the Archbishop was trying to get him killed and was sowing discord in his marriage. The Pope, wanting peace, responded that nothing Edward had said made him confident of a lasting settlement. Edward's letter was a mix of claiming the moral high ground and making serious accusations, showing how desperate and frustrated he was. Edward III faced one of the most challenging moments of his reign in 1341. After a series of unsettling events, including rumors about his wife Philippa and severe financial pressures, Edward felt cornered and paranoid. The Archbishop of Canterbury, John Stratford, seemed to be at the center of it all. Feeling betrayed and threatened, Edward made a daring escape from Flanders back to England, narrowly avoiding a deadly storm. Upon his return, Edward's anger and frustration boiled over. He demanded answers and action, but the situation was far more complex than he initially realized. The Archbishop, who had fled to Canterbury, saw Edward's behavior as tyrannical and compared it to the actions of Edward's father, Edward II. The Archbishop accused Edward of seizing people, making unseemly processes, and violating Magna Carta. He even threatened to excommunicate those around the king who were spreading false charges against him. Edward, not one to back down, issued a document known as the Libellus Famosus, which he used to accuse the Archbishop of treason and criminal negligence. He sent copies of this document across the country and to the Pope, seeking to isolate and exile the Archbishop. However, the Archbishop had a strong following and the support of the Church, which made Edward's task difficult. The tension reached its peak when Edward summoned a parliament in April 1341. He barred the Archbishop from entering the Painted Chamber, the main meeting place, but the Archbishop refused to leave. This led to a dramatic confrontation, with the Archbishop raising his cross and cursing Edward's supporters. The situation became so heated that even the Earl of Northampton, a trusted ally, failed to mediate. It was the aged Earl of Surrey who stepped in, reminding everyone that a parliament was not valid if people with no right to be there were present, and those who should lead were barred. This opened the door to a peaceful resolution. After several days of negotiations, a group of prelates, magnates, and commoners presented an appeal to the king on the Archbishop's behalf. Edward, seeing that his accusations were not meeting with popular support, was forced to reconcile with the archbishop. Despite the crisis, Edward and Philippa's marriage remained strong, and he continued to support his children, including John of Gaunt, whom he never doubted. The events of 1341 were a test of Edward's leadership and the strength of his relationships, but they ultimately showed that even in the face of adversity, he could still find a way to move forward. The crisis of 1341 was a turning point in Edward III's reign, a moment that forced him to confront the limits of his power and the importance of maintaining the trust of his people. It was a lesson in the complexities of medieval politics and the delicate balance between the king's authority and the rights of his subjects. Edward's ability to navigate this storm and find a resolution demonstrated his resilience and his commitment to the welfare of his kingdom.